So hopefully you were able to get this solution, but if not, then just follow along and you'll get the solution now. So you can see here in our expression at the top, you'll see that we have an x plus 5 and an x plus 5 in both terms. So these are factors here, okay? So this is being multiplied by the x plus 5 here is being multiplied by the negative 2, so we can factor out this x plus 5. Now what that means is I'm going to pull out the x plus 5 outside the parentheses. Okay, so the goal is to take this x plus 5 and pull it outside the parentheses. And it may help you. So notice these green parentheses. Let me just go ahead and highlight these two parentheses in green so you can see that these are actually the same parentheses, the same set of parentheses. And what's going to go in here is what I have left over after I factor out this x plus 5. So I factor out my x plus 5. That's what this is. So I do x plus 5. So I have factored out this x plus 5 from my parentheses. Now, I need to figure out what's left over inside the green parentheses, that is, inside these that go here. So if I pull out this x plus 5, that is, I'm factoring it out, I'm left with an x. So we just have an x here, and then on this side, I'm pulling out an x plus 5 from that expression, and then I'm left with a negative 2, so minus 2. So that is our fully factored expression. And at this point, you may be thinking, this is just the greatest day ever. Best day ever. But you're not done with the problem yet. You still have to solve for your x's.
Do you want my head to explode? In the name of all that is good and decent, no more for today!
So a lot of you, when you get to this point, you think, okay, that's my final solution, but it's not. The whole reason that we're doing this is to solve for our x values. So that's going to be step number 6. We need to solve for our unknown variable here. And in this case, our unknown variable is x. So let's go ahead and write this out, because this is where it gets a little bit different than when we had an equal sign here. And it takes a little bit more thought, but I'm going to walk you through how I think about these problems and how I solve these problems, and it's just going to take a lot of practice on your end to get used to this process. So let's rewrite our expression, and let's just think about exactly what this inequality is saying for just a moment. So I've got x plus 5, x minus 2 is greater than 0. So what does it mean for something to be greater than 0? What that means is, well, you go ahead and tell me, what do you think that it means for something to be greater than 0? Yeah, so hopefully you were able to say that anytime that we have something that is greater than 0, that means it's going to be positive. Now look at the left-hand side of this inequality. How many factors do we have on the left-hand side of the inequality? So hopefully you were able to say that there is one factor, and then there is a second factor here. Okay, so these are factors because they're being multiplied together. And if we're multiplying these two things, then the product of these two, that's what we call the result after we multiply two numbers or two quantities. When we find the product of these two factors, it has to be greater than 0. That is, the product of these two has to be positive. And the only way that we can do that is if this factor, this entire quantity, is positive, and then we say times, and the second factor is also positive. So we would have a positive times a positive, and that would give me a positive number out there. Okay? But that's not the only way that we could get a positive number out. We could also have this entire quantity as a negative, so we could do the first factor negative times the second factor also negative, and that would result in a value that is greater than 0 or positive, right? So this either has to be negative and this negative, or this has to be positive and that has to be positive. So now let's write each scenario out explicitly and see if we can solve our inequalities. So we start by saying that x plus 5 x plus 5 has to be greater than 0, that is, x plus 5 has to be positive, and x minus 2 has to be greater than 0, or positive. Or we can have a second situation, so I'll put a big or here, or we can have x plus 5 less than 0, that is, x plus 5 is negative, and, put an and here, and at the same time, x minus 2 has to be less than 0. So there's two situations here. We either have to have x plus 5 is positive and x minus 2 is positive, or we need to have x plus 5 is negative and x minus 2 is negative. So let's solve each of these four inequalities. So we start by solving the first one by subtracting 5 on both sides, and we get x is greater than negative 5, and here, okay, plus 2, and we end up getting x has to be greater than plus 2, or, so these are our constraints. These are telling us what our constraints are on x. Or, we need to have the situation, x, okay, we subtract 5 from both sides, subtract 5, x is less than negative 5, and x, okay, we add 2 to both sides, add 2, and we get x is less than positive 2. Which you don't have to include the positive there, you can just leave it out. So, that being said, let's actually look at each of these constraints or each of these inequalities and see if we can narrow it down to an easier expression to understand. So let's look at this first set of inequalities. So what this is saying is that x has to be greater than negative 5 and x has to be greater than positive 2. So these are our constraints here. Now, let's think about these constraints for just a moment. So this is saying, this first inequality is saying that x has to be greater than negative 5. And at the same time, x has to be greater than positive 2. Okay? Now, if x is greater than positive 2, then it's greater than negative 5. But what this is saying is that x has to be greater than negative 5, and x also has to be greater than positive 2. So, we only need one of these constraints. Okay, we only need one of those, and which one do you think that we need to keep? So hopefully you were able to say that if both of these are our constraints, and this is saying that x is greater than positive 2, x has to be greater than positive 2. Well, is negative 5 greater than positive 2? No, it's not. So, if we're saying that x has to be greater than positive 2, then we need to keep this constraint. Because the reason is, see, if you look at this one, 2 is greater than negative 5. So this constraint satisfies that one, but this constraint does not satisfy the other one. So we have to take the x is greater than positive 2. And feel free to check this. If you were to plug in a negative 4 in for x, would you get a positive or a negative number out? Now try, say, negative 3. So negative 3 is not greater than 2, but try plugging in negative 3 in for x, and you get a positive or a negative number out. So that's a good way of testing whether, or testing to find out which inequality that you need to keep. So in this case, we're going to keep x is greater than 2. So that's one inequality, or one solution to this inequality. Or x has to be less than negative 5, and x has to be less than positive 2. So negative 5 is less than positive 2. So what we can say here is we have two constraints on x. We're saying that x has to be less than negative 5 and x has to be less than 2. Well, negative 5 is less than 2, but 2 is not less than negative 5. So what do you think? Which one of these constraints do I need to keep? Yeah, so in this case, we're going to keep the x has to be less than negative 5. So x is less than negative 5. We do not need both of these constraints. And plus, even if you look over here, we've already said that x has to be greater than 2, but then our second solution is going to be x is less than negative 5. So hopefully this makes sense. Feel free to go through and test these to make sure that they make sense to you. And if they're not quite making sense yet, then just raise your hand and let me know, and we'll walk through another example. But go ahead and finish this, this assignment in class, and just let me know if you have any questions. Thanks, guys.